Welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. Thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and is shown nationwide. What do high school athletes, college athletes, pro athletes, and fraternity initiations have in common? Answer: incidents of hazing. These incidents often include sexual assaults, alcohol abuse, and terrifying personal injuries. Hazing is a common and a painful force among young athletes and fraternities, even though it's a crime in most states. So, how do we stop hazing? Why would anyone join a group that abuses, degrades, or humiliates its members? Joining me now to discuss hazing are Rita Soche from Alabama. She is a single mother of 3 children and today is an anti-hazing activist following the death of her son, Chad. She is the founder of the organization, Chad, Cease Hazing Activities and Deaths. Thank you for joining us, Rita.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Joseph Gervais is a life skills coordinator in the Department of Athletics at the University of Vermont. Joe is a former college student athlete at UVM and a hockey coach. He was an assistant coach for the men's ice hockey team at the University of Vermont when the team had its 1999 season cut short due to a hazing incident. He has turned that regrettable series of events into a learning experience that he has shared across the country. Joe, welcome. Thank you for coming down.
Thank you.
And Michael L. Coyne, a lawyer and the Associate Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Mike, once again, thank you for joining me. And I'm Diane Sullivan, your host for today's program. Rita, I'd like to start with you. If you would, for the audience, tell us about your son Chad's death as a result of a hazing activity.
Chad died from alcohol poisoning in 1993 after months of hazing.
Tough to talk about.
Yeah.
He was a normal kid growing up, right?
Right.
A good athlete.
Right. And he oh gosh, Diane, I'm sorry.
The facts as I know them to be is he was engaged in an initiation whereby they drank and
Right.
he drank himself unconscious. They left him there on the side of a building, ultimately moved him upstairs, left him there, could have been saved, and he choked to death in his own vomit.
Right. But that's not where it started. First of all, he pledged a fraternity, Phi Delta Theta, at Auburn University, even though he wasn't a student at Auburn. He was a student at a junior college near Auburn and was planning on going to Auburn the next quarter.
Mm-hmm.
So they illegally let him pledge, and he knew most of the boys in the fraternity, and many of his friends were also pledging. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a matter of him having to join to meet people, you know, which is a lot.
So he wasn't seeking friendship.
Right, right. He had friends, and he knew most of the guys. But, and one of the reasons he picked Phi Delta Theta was because they were on probation for hazing the year before. And so they were not supposed to have any type of hazing or initiation. And they immediately started hazing them. They were beatings and all different type of hazing activities. And he was in fact hurt, and his father had written a letter, and the so-called Hell Week initiation had been stopped. So the party was the last thing that was to happen.
The last part of the initiation and
Right.
it resulted in
Which
his
was
death.
a Christmas party. And he wasn't even supposed to attend. He was coming home, and I don't know what changed his mind, but he did go to the Christmas party. And it was I didn't know any of this until after his death, but they exchanged a fifth of alcohol with their big brother, which was an older member of the fraternity. And the pledges had to drink theirs straight and fast. And apparently Chad did, along with a lot of the other pledges. And he passed out outside, and they found him, and he had thrown up already. And instead of calling for help, they, like you said, drug him back inside, put him on the floor, and left him. About an hour later, someone came in to get a beer, and they found him trying to breathe, and he was blue. And a bunch of boys came in, and still, second time that night, they didn't call for help. And this, to me, is the most upsetting part, is they stood around Chad watching him die, arguing whether to call 911 for two reasons. One is they knew they were on probation and they didn't want to get in trouble. And two is that the police had already been there 2 times that night to break up fights, and they didn't want to call the police again because they would get in trouble. Yeah. So they stood there and let a boy die instead of getting help.
And I wish I could say this is extraordinary, but based on my research for the show, this goes on pretty repeatedly throughout the country during a semester year. Joe, tell us about the University of Vermont. What happened there?
Well, in our case, it was basically a one-night event. Fortunately, nobody was hurt physically or injured, so it certainly doesn't compare to losing one's son, but it was a party that involved a lot of alcohol, involved some nudity, involved some sexual touching, and one of the first-year players on the team later made a complaint to the department. The university hired a law firm to interview all the players and coaches and anybody who was involved. This was a player-only event that the coaching staff had no knowledge of. But they did all these interviews. The student who made the complaint refused to be interviewed at that time. The players on our team, despite our pleading, decided to get together sort of a common story. They would admit to certain activities but not to others. And that's ultimately what cost them the season, because it later came out. The student who made the complaint later filed a lawsuit naming the head coach, several players, the athletic director, and it later came out in another investigation. It became a very political situation. The team at the University of Vermont is a very high-profile team on campus and in that community and around the state of Vermont, and it became a very political situation and a lot of public attention in the media. And eventually, the Attorney General in Vermont was conducting a second investigation, and during the course of his investigation, it came out that some of the players, virtually all the players, had concealed certain information. So it was at that point that the season was canceled in January, and it was the final 15 games of our season.
And as an assistant coach at the time, you had no idea that anything was amiss in the program?
I had no knowledge that that kind of thing was going on. I was a student athlete in the same program 11 years prior, and we didn't experience any kind of initiation at that time. And from talking with my former teammates and other alumni of the program, as best I can piece it together, it started sometime around 92 or 93, and in a matter of 6 years escalated from something that was relatively small and minor, built up each year into something that really blew up on them.
Wow. Mike, I'm shocked, but I guess my question to you is this. I always thought of hazing in terms of the hijinks of the 50s and 60s. You know, you had to wear a beanie all day in class or carry somebody's books. And now we're hearing of something much more vicious and brutal going on, where people's lives are being ended. Any comment as to why this is so?
No, Diane, I mean, as to why students now engage in much riskier behavior, and it's not just hazing, but they do. I mean, generally on campus at the high school level, students are engaged generally in more riskier behavior than you saw take place in the 50s and 60s. Why we see this sort of explosion from 1980 on in much more violent behavior that often involves sexual acts as well. I can't account for it, other than that some would argue that the society has grown more violent and more tolerant in the last 20 years, and maybe that's not a good thing.
You sent your eldest son off to college this year. Was this a part of your worry?
No, not really. I mean, the alcohol overuse, which I think we all worry about, is regardless of what college they go to when they leave the safety of our own homes. So, I mean, that is one, but he's not playing sports at that level. He'll play intramural sports, but not the organized sports that you sometimes see this associated with. There are no fraternities or sororities on that campus where, again, you see that type of behavior more prevalent. So we've got some safety nets where we're looking at. And I think in meeting the people on campus and talking to a number of the different administrators, we're pretty comfortable that they keep a close eye on these types of things to make sure that there isn't some type of horrendous situation. I mean, that's the first thing, and to try to prevent this is hopefully the coaches, the other administrators on campus take a very serious look at it and monitor it very, very carefully, because kids are always going to try and violate the rules. The question is, can we catch them before they really do a lot of damage?
Joe, when I was preparing for the show, I started off with the premise that hazing was a part of fraternity initiations. Never had any idea that it is a part of athletics, high school, college, pro. 80%, at least that's what the statistics show, of athletes are involved in some type of hazing. Is it that prevalent in your opinion?
Well, I was surprised by that figure. That came out of a study by Alfred University in 1999, a national survey of college student athletes. And they broke hazing or initiations down into component behaviors. And so that figure includes questionable behaviors, which would include things that are embarrassing or degrading, alcohol-related initiations, and unacceptable initiations, which would be dangerous or illegal activities. And so those three elements combined, 80% of over 2,000 athletes who responded to the survey responded that they've experienced it. But the important part of that figure is another figure, in that only 12% of those same athletes indicate that they've been hazed. They report the behaviors, but don't consider it hazing. And to me, that's one of the biggest challenges, is that young people, high school students, and the same phenomenon was found when Alfred did a high school study, that many students, 48% of high school students in groups report the behaviors, but only 14% report being hazed. So there's a discrepancy between what the community considers hazing and what the young people think is okay.
But a lot of them do not even know that it's hazing. When I give speeches, I talk to, I talk to college levels, but I also talk to high school and middle school, and they'll come up to me afterwards and they'll say, "Gosh, I went through that, but I didn't even know that was hazing."
What do they think it is?
They think that it's just something that they have to go through, like especially like bands, school bands. They've been hazing for years, and the kids that belong think that that's what they have to do to be a part of it. Most swim teams,
soccer teams,
they just think that that's what they have to do to get in.
So a kid believes if they want to play sports or they want to be a part of the band that they have to endure this, at best, humiliation, at worst, vicious act.
Right.
What advice do any of you have for kids that may be watching or their parents? What do you tell a kid who really wants to play hockey on the team, but he knows through the grapevine that he's going to have to endure this type of activity? How does he get to be a player but not go through the haze?
Well, it's a hard one, but to me, what I tell athletes, and I talk to a whole range of athletes of all ages, that you have to stand up for what you believe in. I think one reason that students put up with this, no matter what kind of group, is that they have a perception that the consequences of not taking part are going to be very severe. And I believe that in many cases, those consequences won't be as severe as what they're about to go through in hazing. But because of the atmosphere around the team, because of the kind of peer pressure and their desire to belong to that group, that they put up with it. I've talked with athletes who have taken a stand, and they report that in the end they've been respected for it, for taking that stand. But at the time, they're afraid of those potential consequences.
Mike, hazing is illegal.
It is. But the problem becomes, Diane, as to what you define as hazing, what types of activities, and at what level. You know, many of the statutes that we see in various states don't talk about what types of activities at the secondary level would be considered hazing. They limit it really to college activities and the like. So the first question you ask yourself is when you try to figure out is, well, what would we consider hazing to be? Whether it's the consumption of alcohol to the point where minors shouldn't consume alcohol at all, much less consume it to the point where they become violently ill. What types of physical activities would one consider to be sufficiently dangerous that they'd constitute hazing? Putting aside all the sexual touching and those things which violate so many statutes that it's just clear that they shouldn't be engaged in. But I think a lot of the kids try to figure out, well, where's that line? I mean, I don't really want to cause a big stink. I'd like to belong. I'd like to go along. But at the same point, they then engage in more riskier behavior. So hopefully you tell them what I tell my own kids is make good choices. You know, if it's a dangerous activity that they don't feel they should participate in, they shouldn't. They should go to the coach. They should go to someone in the administration they trust, and they should say, listen, I really want to play soccer. I really want to play football. I want to do band. But I'm not going to participate in activity that's dangerous. And the fact is they then hopefully do what we want them to do, is they stand up, they make good choices, and they, worst case, they realize that sometimes you sacrifice to do the right thing, and in the long run, hopefully they benefit by it. But it's a very, very difficult choice to ask a 12-year-old or 14-year-old, a 16, 18, 20, to go against what the peer group is doing.
If the kid is a stand-up guy or gal, and they go to administration at the school or they go to the coach, how do you think that's received if the kid says, hey, I want to play on your team, but I don't want to go through the hazing? Does the coach or does the school really do something?
Ask the coach.
Well, it depends on the coach, and it depends on what kind of atmosphere there is within that department. Many coaches have experienced these things themselves as athletes. Not all of them. I hadn't experienced it. But sometimes they have sort of a look the other way attitude about it, or in some cases, these are very secretive things that go on. I was an assistant coach for 8 years and never once heard about an initiation. And so it's difficult to know what's going on. Is it a coach's responsibility to know what athletes are doing 24 hours a day? I'm not sure it is. But I have heard and read about a lot of instances where people have made complaints to administration. Administration has done very little about it.
Rita?
Well, in my son's case, everyone failed him. He asked for help from the fraternity, from the school, from friends, even from his parents, and we all failed him. The school looks the other way. Hazing is accepted. The fraternity looked the other way. Myself and his dad had no idea that hazing was dangerous, that it it was that bad.
That it was life-threatening.
Right.
I'll take a hard line for you, Diane, because I disagree slightly. I think it is the coach's responsibility. Having been involved with youth sports organizations and having coached previously, I think a team takes its lead from its coach. And I think if the coach and the administration of the school takes a hard line and tells the kids right at the outset what types of activities are permitted and not permitted, and if zero tolerance exists, that if any of these activities are engaged in, the student athlete is no longer an athlete, and from an administration standpoint, no longer a student at the institution, my guess is what you're going to find is that these incidents of dangerous activity are going to be reduced immediately. And I think that's what it takes, is strong leadership, and I think we have it at the University of Vermont now, so you don't see those activities taking place. But I think we need it straight down the line at every secondary and college in the country if you want to eliminate young kids meeting their deaths when they just never should have been involved, even close to those situations.
We need to take a break, so to our viewing audience, please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
They came from every corner of the country, from small towns and big cities. But they all shared one thing in common. They belonged to a family called Marines, a tough and determined few dedicated to protecting everything we hold sacred. And still, they come. Celebrate the 225-year history of those proud few who have earned the title Marine.
This is the story about a group of kids who volunteered.
Doing something nice for someone.
We fixed stuff.
Did some art projects with the kids.
We fixed up his house.
We worked in the woods.
Cleaned up the park.
Did something for the planet.
We just did it.
No other reason. And you know what? It was great.
At first, they didn't know each other.
Well, that didn't last long.
This guy is really funny.
These are my new friends.
Are you into it?
Call 4-H or check out our website at areyouintoit.com.
Kids aren't afraid of other kids. Or people with different color skin. That's because kids know there are other things. Worse things. Bigger things to be afraid of. Like monsters from outer space! Remember, friends come in all colors.
Before you know it, she talks. Before you know it, she walks. Before you know it, she knows you. Before you know it, she has a heart. Before you know you're pregnant, when your baby's no bigger than a grain of rice, before she's a twinkle in your eye, that's when you need to take folic acid every day. After that, it's too late to prevent some serious birth defects. Folic acid now, before you know it.
Welcome back to the Educational Forum, where we're discussing hazing. Before we talk about what we can do about hazing to prevent it, I want to get to what causes groups to haze. What are they seeking? Is it the group mentality that you're going to live and die for the fraternity or the sports team? What's the goal? It seems like craziness to me.
I can answer that. It is craziness, but that is what they think, that they take these pledges, young men that are wanting to be a part of this group, and they start off with offering them friendship and wining and dining them and making them feel welcome. And then they gradually start the hazing. And it's so gradual that they really don't even realize what's going on. And by this time, they have bonded with the other pledges. And in Chad's case, they keep the pledges together. They don't want them to be friends with the outside, the other people at the college.
So group loyalty.
Right. So when the hazing starts, the pledges feel loyal to the other pledges. And in Chad's situation, because we started talking, because I knew about the minor activity, hazing activity, like having to clean the house, having to do personal chores for the members.
And I think we can all live with that.
Right, sort of.
Okay, sort of.
Right, but the fact that it leads to more dangerous activity, I can't live with it. But anyway, when they start the dangerous activities, the pledges are so bonded that they feel like they have to stay in it together to protect each other, because they're told, like, if one wants to leave, well, we're going to hurt the rest of the boys if you walk out.
But if you're a friend and you're so bonded to the other pledge, why are you going to paddle them 300 times so that you put them in the hospital?
No, we're not talking about the members.
Okay, what are we talking about?
We're talking about, say you have 10 pledges, and you're bonded with the pledges, and the members are saying, okay, this pledge wants to leave, and they tell this pledge, okay, if you leave, we're going to beat the 9 pledges that are left twice as hard. So this pledge won't leave.
I'm surprised, though, that that pledge wouldn't then go to the police or the school administration and say, hey, I want to get out, but they're threatening to do something.
But what happens? If that pledge goes, okay, and this happened not long ago in Johnson City, Tennessee. 3 boys were part of a pledge group. They were pledged horribly. They went to the school, reported it. The fraternity was closed down. They had to leave the school. They were harassed so bad, except for one young man, Josh Buchanan, who had a scholarship at the school. He couldn't leave because he would lose his scholarship. But these fraternity boys have harassed him to the point to where he is so emotionally upset that he has got to leave. Now, the school will not protect him. The national fraternity will do nothing. So it's his life that is ruined because he went and reported the hazing.
Let's check with our lawyer as to what this young man should do.
Well, he's probably going to sue, but he doesn't have a choice at this point probably but to leave, just from out of his own sense of personal safety and the like. The problem is, Diane, is that we have over 40 states that have anti-hazing statutes, but who becomes responsible under those anti-hazing statutes is a different story. And again, like we said earlier, what constitutes hazing? So he, in all likelihood, will in fact bring some form of suit to try and recover what his next college is going to cost him and the like, and hopefully for some of his emotional distress that he suffered as a result of these types of actions. But it's not easy to try and succeed against those, the school or those that actually have money to compensate him for his injuries. I mean,
and if you don't
you're not going to sue a 20-year-old kid, or you could, but you're not likely to get a lot of money out of a 20-year-old kid who's causing most of the harassment.
And I don't know the law on this, but if there isn't bodily injury, I think in a lot of states you can't go forward with an action.
That's right, and a lot of times, Diane, remember what the principal defense is going to be. He consented to it.
Assumption of the risk.
Right? He agreed to do it.
Yeah.
It's not something he was forced to do. He could have walked away. I mean, theoretically, he could walk away from the peer pressure.
And should walk away.
But see, they did walk away.
You're right. These boys did.
Yeah.
And they still made their lives miserable.
Right.
Except the one boy who felt trapped there for the money.
But he walked away from the hazing.
Right.
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 But the harassment continues.
Right.
Many states do not allow consent as a defense, including Vermont. But that's still, that element of the group dynamic is very much at work. It's slightly different on an athletic team, I think, because for the most part, those new members, putting the new members in their place.
Joe, give us some advice on how to prevent hazing.
Well, it's got to be a combination of things. Mike has mentioned, stiff penalties. And students themselves, high school students and college students, report that the most effective means to prevent it is harsh punishment for those who do haze. But that alone's not enough, because similar to alcohol on campus, if you squash it here, it pops up somewhere else. It's just going to go underground. So that has to be in concert with education, both staff, coaches, staff who work in fraternities, advisors, and administrators at the school, to understand what hazing is, convince them that it's a problem, and then talk about how else to go about it.
And it's something that has to reoccur every year or every semester. What I found is a school has a problem and they may have a death or some serious event occur, and then they have all these meetings and they talk to the students and they say hazing cannot go on, but then they do no more. And 2 years from then, it's forgotten.
This population turns
Right.
over every year.
Right.
And at UVM right now, the senior class is the last class that was there when our team had its season canceled. So they had pretty strong memories about how miserable that time was. But after that, the students coming in have maybe a vague idea of what happened, but very little knowledge of the dynamics that were at work. So you have to keep it in front of them constantly.
What happened at your son's school following his death?
Well, at Auburn, they immediately swept it under the rug. First of all, he wasn't a student at Auburn, so no one could call Auburn and find out that Chad died at a fraternity at Auburn. Second, the fraternity will have no record that Chad died because he was an illegal pledge. So as far as Chad is concerned, at Auburn and at Phi Delta Theta, he doesn't exist. That death is just nothing. Auburn University supports the city of Auburn, so the crime was nothing. The city is not going to do anything against the university. The police were not notified until the evidence was cleaned up. The Nationals were called first. They had someone there that night. The members were not talked to by the police until the next day after the National
Received the call?
Were there talking to him. He immediately told them not to say anything. And I asked, when we got there, you know, that was my first question, is why were they not, you know, asked what happened that night when it was fresh on their mind? And they said, well, they couldn't have told us anything because they were drunk. Well, that's when you find out what really happened. You know, the one young man that fell out of the window and was taken to the hospital and arrested for underage drinking, he was the only one that really probably gave the only truthful account of what happened that night. And his father refused to let him sign his statement.
There is my recollection, this was probably the most horrifying thing I learned as a first-year law student. There is no duty to render aid.
No, not generally.
Unless you're a lifeguard and there's a contractual duty, there is no duty.
No, and that's the problem with a situation like this, is that we've got a bunch of people who really are able to do something, or at least take some steps that might have saved his life. And generally, they're not under not a legal obligation. They're certainly under a moral obligation to try and step in and help. But I doubt that they were charged with any type of criminal liability. I mean, you could have a DA look at it, and my guess is there are some criminal statutes in some states that certainly would have covered the situation. But what you do have is already been pointed out, is you've got a bunch of young kids, you've got a powerful institution, you've got a close relationship between the institution and the city or town. It's a difficult situation to get someone to go forward with.
You know, I sat down before we had this show, and I looked at the list of deaths that have occurred since the 1800s as a result of hazing activities or binge drinking in fraternities. And it seems to me, based on what I looked at, that most of the time alcohol is a part. If we could take alcohol out of the mix, how would hazing change?
I think incidents would go down. I'm not sure it would be entirely eliminated, because I think groups still they need to bring in new members. They still want to have some kind of initiation, but I think alcohol causes many, many of the problems that happen. So in terms of the education that happens, I think it can't be just about hazing. I think it has to be about other health issues, alcohol, drugs, in appeal to the moral sense in these students that you can't harm somebody.
Mike, can you think of anything legally that could be done to help eliminate hazing to the degree that it's being engaged in?
I think stronger statutes with zero tolerance by administrations and the significant education. I think Joe had it straight on, is that it takes a bunch of different things in place if we really want to try and eradicate this. Go back to your last thought. Yes, alcohol is often involved in these activities, but the problem is that even if it's not hazing, there's far too much alcohol abuse on our campuses, as well as, unfortunately, probably at the high school level now as well. So, I mean, the only way you could eliminate that really is to go back to prohibition. It is what kids are going to do, and again, that starts, and I think we see it much more now, as a much earlier education process about alcohol consumption and alcohol abuse. And I think hopefully a strong education program at the early level helps kids start to make better choices about those types of things.
So it's unrealistic to think that fraternities will go dry on campus.
I can think of, I can think of one thing, well, two things that can do it. When they start something with the universities, when they start charging the universities for the crimes of hazing, and start holding the universities accountable, then the hazing will slow down. And I don't know how they'll do it, but that's what is going to happen for it to stop.
What about holding the Greek nationals liable?
Oh yeah,
well,
and
it's both.
Yeah.
If you had stronger statutes that would hold the organizations themselves, be it the colleges, the high school districts, or the fraternal organizations, civilly responsible for the acts of their members, then you would have a much more vigilant enforcement policy by those organizations.
And it's the same way with alcohol.
Sure.
When you start holding the universities and colleges responsible and accountable for the alcohol abuse, then the alcohol consumption will go down.
Right. We need to take a break, but before we do, any advice for a kid who really doesn't want to drink, who doesn't want to haze or be hazed? Can they survive on campus today?
I think they can survive. I think they have to be willing to put up with some negative responses by their peers. But hopefully, and my goal when I educate students is to establish sort of a tipping point where enough students understand that that's wrong, and that the more students who understand that, the easier it will be for someone to stand up for their own beliefs.
Okay, so to our viewing audience, we need to take a break, so please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Thanks.
Every time an adult gives up on our kids, every time we surrender to the belief that their future is out of our hands, another child is left behind. I'm General Colin Powell, and I don't believe in giving up. That's why I'm asking you to join America's Promise. Log on to americaspromise.org or give us a call. Whoever you are, wherever you are, you can do something important. Pull your weight.
They won't leave you for someone younger. They won't notice you've gained weight. They won't fire you. They won't talk about you behind your back. All they'll ever do is love you. Find the love of your life. Visit PetFinder at aspca.org.
Worthless piece of junk! Hey, this phone's taken.
Son, will this help you?
Maybe the last thing you would do for somebody should be the first.
Thanks. Hey, I appreciate it.
A message from the Credit Union Foundation and your hometown credit union.
Welcome back to the Educational Forum. We're discussing hazing. One thing I wanted to talk about, Rita, perhaps you could share some insight on this, is what hazers cannot take into account. It is impossible to know the pledge's mental status. I mean, they might be suffering from depression, they might be suicidal, they might have a drinking problem. How does that play into the problem of hazing?
Well, it plays into it a lot. I know there's been many deaths with young men who have had underlying problems, heart problems, asthma, different health problems that they didn't even know they had, where they've had to do different types of exercises and they've died from them. But one of the problems that aren't mentioned often is the emotional problems or situations that the hazer may bring into the hazing. You don't know what the person that is hazing brings into it. An example of that is when Chad was being hazed, and I didn't find out about this until after his death, but there was a situation where they were taken off campus and beaten, and he was hurt. And I found out that after he died, that the young man that hazed him the most was a young man who was short and, how do you say it, was not very nice looking.
And was on a power trip.
Right, and didn't like my son because he was tall.
Mm-hmm.
And he was taking his anger out on Chad because of his life, because he was short. And I think a lot of times that's what they do, is they take their anger out on these young men, and it's their way of having power, plus taking their rage out
on somebody else.
Yes.
Mike, that sounds like assault and battery, but because of the consensual aspect of it.
Well, that's the problem, Diane, is that there are some criminal aspects to it. There's no doubt about that. But there may be this defense of consent. Most states actually don't, as Joe said, do not allow for consent to be a defense to the hazing violation. But some states, actually probably about 18, still do find that the student's voluntary participation in this horrendously dangerous activity is a defense. But there are many criminal statutes that are violated often during hazing activities.
Let's go back to some of the solutions. It has been suggested that perhaps what we do is put supervising adults in some of the Greek fraternity houses, that might eliminate the problem. What's your reaction to that from an effectiveness standpoint?
Well, who's that person going to be? Who are you going to get to go in there and take on the responsibility of being responsible for that group of people?
It's not a house mother.
Right.
At Chad's fraternity, there was a house mother, you know, downstairs during this party.
Wow.
Yeah. And what faculty or staff member is going to want to take on that responsibility as well? It's difficult to find who it is. In terms of athletics, I've mentioned in my fear when talking about the education, people talk about alternative activities, other team building kinds of things, rope courses and whatnot, but my fear is that no matter how many things a school or an organization sponsors, the kids themselves are going to want to do their own thing.
Well, in prepping for the show, kids that are going to go to high school, football, that's a big problem, is they go to these camps. Okay, they go to football camp, they probably go to hockey camp, they probably go to soccer camp, and it's a sleepover. What's going on in these camps, to me, is incredible.
But even the camps themselves, Diane, to some extent, this macho rite of passage that we run till we vomit, and we do these other what are dangerous activities. It really is an education process that's needed throughout in order to really realize that we shouldn't have people engaged in this type of dangerous activity. There's a line. There's a great necessity for team building and group dynamics to be achieved, but we really have to be a lot more careful than we've been in the past.
But at camps and things like that, they are supervised and they have chaperones. But there again, the problem is the chaperones sort of agree. And that happened in a Catholic school, where in middle school, where they had different activities, hazing activities, where the adults were there and said it was okay.
Are the adults consenting, as you say, they're saying okay? Or is it that this goes on while the adults are sleeping or engaged with others?
No, in this situation, the adults were there consenting. And in Mobile, we have high school fraternities and sororities, and they have hazing activities. And the adults believe in it. I mean, they see nothing wrong with it.
There's a larger societal issue. Dr. Elizabeth Allen at the University of Maine and others have taken a gender theory approach to looking at hazing and looking at how boys and men in particular, hazing happens in women's organizations and girls groups as well, but particularly the way that young men are socialized to be tough, to endure a lot of pain, to put up with as much as possible, contributes to this whole thing, and that plays very much into the athletic team's role, especially in certain sports where you're expected to withstand a lot of that thing, and it's a test of how functional you're going to be within that team.
I can't excuse any of that, but understand that maybe we can. But what I cannot understand is today, almost in a majority, I will say, of the hazing incidents around schools, around sports, is the sexual deviant component. What accounts for that? What do we do about it? How do we advise the kids in the audience?
You have any easy questions? I don't know. I mean, do you want to blame it on MTV? Do you want to blame it on the permissive nature of society today? You could probably find, we should have a psychiatrist here to help us with the cause of this really horrific trend to involve some type of significant sexual component to these types of hazing activities. Obviously violates the criminal law. I think if the students were more aware of the penalties that they would face for these types of activities, they would be far less prone to engage in them because they think somehow this is horseplay and good-natured fun. And the fact is there are people in jail doing 10 to 20 years for some of the activities that these college and high school kids are engaged in at this point.
And you're right. What we're missing is the psychological expertise here, but it seems to me it is pretty much common sense to a kid that I don't want to do this, I'm not ever going to do this, but yet they endure it, they're horrified by it, and they do it to become a part of the team or the organization.
Ostracism is worse. You know, I mean, and that's what they risk is that, okay, he's out. We're not going to talk to him anymore. He's not one of us.
You know, I'd be saying, I don't want to talk to you ever again if you want me to do that. I mean, it's so deviant.
I've heard a psychologist speak to this issue, and he talks about emotional displacement, where students report very negative feelings. They report being hurt and yet they don't have an outlet for that. They can't turn it back on the people who haze them, because that's not how it works. So they wait and they get the next class. They get the next group that comes in, and that is how hazing is perpetuated.
Wow.
We went through it, right? I mean, that's the logic. We went through it. If it was good enough for us, it's good enough for them. And that's why it continues.
You know, you tend to think when you step away from it, you've got one person in charge of the hazing that has psychological problems, as you suggested earlier. But then it goes on every year, so that certainly doesn't account for it.
Yeah. And the same psychologist as Dr. Michael Milburn at UMass Boston spoke about cognitive dissonance is the term he used, in that we don't accept the behaviors, we don't agree with those behaviors and those acts, we don't want to do that, so instead of changing the acts, we change our attitude about the acts. So these are some of the psychological phenomena that he sees involved, and in his opinion it starts way early. Bullying in elementary schools, middle schools, and it's an attitude about, and it is all about power. The sexual activities, it's not about sex, it's about power. Just as in when people are raped, it's not about the sex, it's about the power. So I think as much education as we can do about respect, about the moral side of things, I think is extremely important.
What about the beginning of each semester, defining, as you suggested, Mike, what is hazing? This. These are hazing. They normally lead to X, and if you go along with it, it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and you can end up dead.
Well, I'm not so sure I'd say worse and worse and worse. This is it. This is not tolerant. This is what we don't tolerate. This is what happens if you do violate this provision. And you know what? We want you to sign this. We want your parents to sign this. We want there to be an understanding from the outset that these are the rules in which we're playing by. And if they're violated, we're done.
And then enforce the rules.
Right, and then enforce it.
The school does not enforce it.
Well, yeah.
I mean...
Well, we'll make them criminally liable if they don't. How about that?
Yeah, that's what it's going to take. I mean, if that would have happened, my son would be alive. I mean, Phi Delta Theta has a history from 1960 that is unbelievable. I mean, they have been on probation, they have been kicked off campus. I mean, letter after letter, the horrible things that they have done. And, you know, the school writes a letter to the national writes a letter to the school. This fraternity should be gone, this fraternity should never be on campus. But the next day, they're allowing them back on campus. You know, it's just a game they play with each other. And then a kid dies, and they're still playing the same game.
In hindsight, I realize, reader, that our vision is always 20/20. And so I don't mean this in a disrespectful way. But do you think you could have had a different result had your husband, instead of writing the school, went into the school?
Oh my God, yes! Yeah. Oh gosh! I mean, yes. I mean, the first time Chad told me, you know, that they were hazing, I should have gone up there like a crazy person, demanding. But what do you do when your child said, "Oh, Mom, please don't embarrass me.
Yeah, right.
You know, I can handle this. I can, you know, we've got to do this quiet." And even when he went to his dad, he didn't go and ask his dad to go on his behalf.
Yeah.
He went because his friend had gotten hurt, was being beaten up so badly. He said, he called his dad, he says, "Please do something, but don't let them know who it is." So his dad wrote the letter anonymously. And this child was being hazed so badly because he was a legacy, which means his dad was in the fraternity and his grandfather was in the fraternity. But so that's why parents are so scared to go and say, you know, to take care of this right now.
Would you think it would be good advice for a parent if their child came to them and said, "Hey, this is what what's going on. For the parent to say, you are not to be involved in that organization, I'm pulling you out of that school.
Yeah,
well, like I said, vision is always great after the tragedy.
But the kids know that too, Di, and that's why they're not necessarily going to come to you and tell you about it, because they don't want you taking these steps for them. They want to try and get through this and get past this themselves. That's the problem with peer pressure, Diane. It's a very, very powerful dynamic.
Why do they want to belong that bad?
We all want to belong, Diane, don't we? We all want to belong to some extent. That's the problem. You know, we're sitting here 40-something saying, you know, we're just going to stand up and make the right decision. When you're younger, that's so much harder to be able to say, I'm willing to stand by myself as opposed to be part of something.
You don't think you're going to die.
Right, that's right. You're invincible when you're young as well. That's right.
But even with this young man, he couldn't go to his dad because his dad wouldn't let him get out. I mean, to some parents, that's very important. You don't get out of that fraternity because that's my fraternity. So,
Joe, I'm not setting you up, but University of Vermont, you know, I'm looking through the deaths and I see kids dying, you know, out windows, off cliffs. Shouldn't the school see some of what's going to happen because they're having deaths occur on their campus and do something about it?
Well, I think a lot of schools think they're doing things. There was a policy in place. That policy had been communicated, but not broadly enough, not emphatically enough. And you know, that was 10 years prior. I believe it was around 1990, 1991.
That's right.
So that student population, unless the school is right in the face with this issue all the time, they're going to forget about it. And the students will have no idea. Students that I talk to in our campus have no idea that students died on our campus 10, 12 years ago.
Final comment for the audience, Mike?
I just hope that we can create a greater policy of education so that the students will be more aware of the types of behavior that they shouldn't be engaged in. And then that schools and administrations become more vigilant about enforcing it. Enforcing
their rules. Thank you, Rita, so much for sharing your tragedy with us. Joe, thank you. Mike, thanks for being here. To our viewing audience, until next time, be well. Thanks.
Morgan! Phone! Yeah, Morgan here. So, hi. Right now? Okay. The eensy-weensy spider climbed up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain. And the eensy-weensy spider climbed up the spout again.
I love you, Daddy.
I love you, sweetheart.
Family. Isn't it about time?
What can I say? It's my girl.
From the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
You know how inquisitive kids are. That's why you store sharp objects in a safe place. Keep medicines out of reach. And if you have a gun, you keep it unloaded and locked away. As concerned members of the television community, we urge you to be just as careful with television. Kids don't always know what they're watching. That's why you should.